The beautiful daughter of his dead neighbor said, "All 7 of us are yours." James Morrison sat in his worn leather armchair, the same one he had occupied every evening for the past 15 years. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The only sound came from the old grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking away the seconds of another ordinary Tuesday evening. At 52 years old, James had grown accustomed to the silence. It had been 3 years since his wife Margaret passed away, and he had learned to find peace in the solitude. He was a retired teacher, having spent 30 years shaping young minds at Lincoln High School. His days now consisted of simple routines: morning coffee on the porch, tending to a small garden, reading thick novels that Margaret had always wanted him to finish, and the occasional video call with his 2 grown children who lived on the opposite coast. Life was predictable, manageable, and safe. His neighbor, Robert Chen, had been one of his few regular contacts with the outside world. Robert was a hard-working man, a single father who had lost his wife to cancer 8 years ago. James remembered the day Robert moved in next door with his 7 children. It seemed impossible that one man could manage such a large family alone, but Robert did it with grace and determination. Over the years, James and Robert had become good friends. They would share weekend barbecues, help each other with yard work, and sometimes just sit on the porch steps talking about life, loss, and the challenges of moving forward after tragedy. James had watched Robert's children grow up from his kitchen window. There was Elena, the eldest, a bright and beautiful young woman who had taken on so much responsibility after her mother's death. She was 24 now, always helping her father, always putting her siblings first. Then came Marcus at 19, a troubled teenager who struggled to find his path but had a good heart underneath the tough exterior. Sarah was 17, quiet and studious, always with her nose in a book. The twins, Sophie and Sarah, were 11, full of energy and mischief, keeping everyone on their toes. Then there was 9-year-old Tommy, the peacemaker of the family. And finally, little Danny, just 6 years old, with curious eyes and an infectious laugh. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. James was working in his garden when he heard the ambulance sirens. His heart sank when he saw the emergency vehicle pull up to Robert's house. He rushed over, his hands still covered in dirt, and found the paramedics working frantically on Robert, who had collapsed in the living room. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her younger siblings clustering behind her in confusion and fear. Robert had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time they reached the hospital, he was gone. Just like that, in a matter of minutes, 7 children had lost their father and their anchor in this world. James attended the funeral 4 days later. It was a small, somber affair. The children sat in the front row, Elena holding little Danny on her lap while he cried softly into her shoulder. There were a few people from Robert's workplace, some neighbors, and a handful of distant relatives who James had never seen before. He watched as Elena stood strong for her siblings, accepting condolences with a brave face, though he could see the terror and exhaustion in her eyes. After the funeral, James did what he could. He brought over casseroles, offered to help with yard work, and told Elena that if she needed anything at all, she should not hesitate to ask. She thanked him politely but distantly, as if she was operating on autopilot, just trying to survive each moment. 3 days after the funeral, on that quiet Tuesday evening, James heard a knock on his door. It was unusual for anyone to visit him, especially after dark. He set down his book and walked to the door, wondering if perhaps it was Mrs. Patterson from across the street, who sometimes brought him cookies. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. Elena stood there, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Behind her, lined up like a small parade, were all 6 of her younger siblings. Marcus stood tall but looked uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Sarah clutched a small backpack to her chest. The twins held hands, their faces mirroring expressions of fear and uncertainty. Tommy stood close to Marcus, and little Danny held tightly to Elena's hand, his thumb in his mouth. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late. Can we please come in? I need to talk to you about something very important." James's heart was already racing. Something was terribly wrong. He stepped aside immediately, ushering all 7 children into his modest living room. They filled the space completely, some sitting on the couch, others on the floor, the older ones standing against the walls. The house that had been so quiet just moments ago was now filled with the presence of 7 young souls, each one carrying the weight of fresh grief. "Please sit down, Elena," James said gently, gesturing to his own armchair. "Can I get anyone some water? Something to eat?" The children shook their heads silently. Elena perched on the edge of the chair, looking like she might collapse at any moment. She took a deep breath, struggling to compose herself, and then the words came tumbling out in a rush. "Morrison, we have nowhere else to go. My father, he didn't have much savings. The house was rented, and the landlord wants us out by the end of the month. We have no other family, not really. There's an aunt somewhere in another state, but she's never been part of our lives, and she already said she can't take all of us. And now, Child Protective Services, they're coming tomorrow morning." Her voice broke, and tears began streaming down her face. "They're going to separate us," they told me today. There's no foster home that can take all 7 of us together. They're going to split us up, maybe 2 here, 3 there, send the older ones to group homes. Danny will go to one family, the twins to another, and we'll never be together again. The younger children began crying, too. Little Danny climbed onto Elena's lap, and she wrapped her arms around him protectively. Marcus turned his face to the wall, his shoulders shaking. James felt his own eyes burning with tears. The thought of these children, who had already lost both parents, being torn apart from each other, was unbearable. Elena looked up at James with desperate, pleading eyes. "My father always talked about you, Mr. Morrison. He said you were the most honorable man he knew. He said you understood what it meant to lose someone, to keep going when everything seemed impossible. He trusted you. We all trust you." She paused, taking another shaky breath, and then said the words that would echo in James's mind for the rest of the night. "I know this is crazy. I know it's too much to ask. But, Mr. Morrison, I'm begging you, all 7 of us, we're yours if you'll have us. Please don't let them separate us, please." The room fell completely silent except for the soft crying of the children. James stood frozen, his mind racing in 1,000 directions at once. 7 children. 7 lives depending on his answer. He was 50, 2 years old, living on a modest pension. His house had only 3 bedrooms. He had been alone for 3 years, content in his quiet routine. How could he possibly take care of 7 children? But then he looked at their faces. He saw the fear, the hope, the desperate love they had for each other. He thought of Robert, his friend, who had managed this very thing alone for 8 years. He thought of Margaret, who had always wanted a house full of children but had only been blessed with 2. He thought of the empty rooms in his home, the silent dinners, the endless quiet evenings. "Elena," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "let me think about this tonight. Come back in the morning, before the social worker arrives. I promise you I will have an answer." It wasn't the answer Elena wanted to hear, but she nodded, understanding that what she was asking was enormous. She gathered her siblings, and they filed out into the night, returning to their house next door for one more night together. James closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He walked back to his chair and sat down, but he didn't pick up his book. Instead, he sat in the silence which now felt heavier than ever before. The grandfather clock ticked away the minutes, and James Morrison faced the biggest decision of his entire life. James didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of those 7 children, their eyes filled with fear and desperate hope. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts at once. The practical concerns came flooding in like a tidal wave. How could he possibly afford to feed 7 children? His pension was enough for one person living a simple life, but 7 growing kids would need food, clothes, school supplies, and so much more. His house had only 3 bedrooms. Where would everyone sleep? And what did he know about raising children anymore? His own kids were grown, living their own lives 3,000 miles away. He had been a teacher, yes, but teaching and parenting were very different things. He got out of bed around 2 in the morning and walked to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at the small table where he usually ate his breakfast alone. The house felt different somehow, as if the presence of those 7 children just hours ago had changed the very air inside it. He thought about calling his daughter Jessica or his son Michael, but what would he tell them? That he was considering taking in 7 children? They would think he had lost his mind. As he sipped his tea, memories began flooding back. He remembered when Jessica and Michael were young, how the house had been filled with noise and laughter and chaos. Margaret had loved every minute of it, even the difficult moments. She used to say that a quiet house was a lonely house, and a full house was a blessed house. After she passed away, after the kids moved away for college and then jobs, the silence had felt like a weight on his chest. James walked to the living room and looked at the photographs on the mantel. There was Margaret on their wedding day, her smile bright and full of joy. There was a picture of the whole family at the beach, the kids building sandcastles while Margaret laughed at something James had said. There was another photo of Margaret in the hospital, just weeks before she died, still smiling despite the pain, still radiating love. "What would you do, Maggie?" he whispered to the photograph. He knew the answer already. Margaret would have thrown open the doors without a second thought. She had the biggest heart of anyone he had ever known. She would have figured out the details later, but she never would have let those children be separated. But James wasn't Margaret. He was practical, cautious, someone who planned things carefully. Taking in 7 children wasn't a small decision. It would change everything about his life every single day for years to come. And what if he failed? What if he couldn't handle it? What if he made things worse for them? He walked to the window and looked out at Robert's house next door. The lights were still on. He could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Those children weren't sleeping either. They were probably packing what little they had, preparing for the social worker who would come in the morning to take them away from each other. James thought about Robert then. Really thought about him. His friend had been dealt an impossible hand in life, losing his wife and being left alone with 7 children. But Robert never complained. He worked 2 jobs, came home exhausted, and still made time to help with homework, to play with the little ones, to be present for all of them. James remembered asking him once how he managed it all. Robert had smiled that tired but genuine smile of his and said, "You just do it, James. When people you love need you, you find a way. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up every day and do your best. That's all any of us can do." At that moment, sitting in his dark living room at 3 a.m, James realized something. That he had been just existing for the past 3 years, not really living. He went through the motions of his days, but there was no purpose, no real meaning. Margaret used to say that we're put on this earth to help each other, to make a difference in whatever way we can. What bigger difference could he make than keeping a family together? But still, the fear gripped him. What about the financial burden? He picked up a notepad and started doing calculations. His pension, Social Security benefits for the children since their father had passed away. Maybe Elena could work part-time. It would be tight. Incredibly tight, but maybe possible. He thought about his savings account, the money he had been keeping for emergencies, or maybe a vacation he never took. This was an emergency, the biggest one he could imagine. The bedrooms were another problem. 3 bedrooms for 8 people. He could give the master bedroom to the older girls, Elena and Sarah. The twins could share the 2nd bedroom. Marcus and Tommy could take the 3rd. He could convert the garage into a room for himself and little Danny. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would work. People had lived in tighter spaces and survived. But what about school? Doctor appointments? What if one of them got sick? What about teenage problems and homework and all the things that came with raising children in today's world? James felt overwhelmed just thinking about it. He was 52 years old, set in his ways, used to quiet evenings and predictable days. As dawn began to break through the windows, James made himself another cup of coffee. His hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion and anxiety. He looked at the clock. 6 a.m. The social worker would arrive at Robert's house around 9. Elena said she would come back before then for his answer. He thought about his own children again. Jessica had 2 kids of her own now, living in Seattle where her husband worked for a tech company. Michael was in Boston, building his career as a lawyer, recently engaged to a wonderful woman. They had their own lives, their own paths. But they had also been raised by Margaret, who had taught them the value of compassion and helping others. Would they understand? Or would they think their father was making a terrible mistake? James decided he needed to at least try to talk to them. Despite the early hour, he picked up his phone and called Jessica first. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Dad? Is everything okay?" It's 6 a.m. James explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush. He told her about Robert's death, about the 7 children, about Elena's desperate plea the night before. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Dad," Jessica finally said, her voice careful. "I understand you want to help, but 7 children? That's an enormous responsibility. You're not as young as you used to be. What about your health? Your finances? Have you really thought this through?" "I've been thinking about it all night," James said quietly. "I know it sounds crazy, but Jess, you should have seen their faces. They're going to be separated. These kids have already lost both parents. How can I let them lose each other too?" Jessica sighed. "Dad, I know your heart is in the right place, but wanting to help and actually being able to help are 2 different things. Maybe there's another way. Maybe you could help Elena find resources or advocate for them to stay together in the system." "The system is going to split them up," James said firmly. "That's already decided. This is their only chance." He could hear Jessica talking to her husband in the background. Finally, she came back on the line. "Dad, can you at least wait a few days? Let me and Mike talk to you about this. Maybe we can figure something out together, come up with a better plan." "I don't have a few days," James said. The social worker comes this morning. After he hung up with Jessica, he called Michael. His son's reaction was similar, concerned and cautious, worried about their father taking on too much. Both of his children loved him and wanted to protect him, but neither understood what he was feeling in his heart. James set down the phone and walked back to the window. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was going to be a beautiful day. Across the yard, he saw the door to Robert's house open. Elena stepped out onto the porch, looking toward his house. Even from this distance, he could see the exhaustion and fear on her face. He checked the clock again. 7:30. He had an hour and a half before the social worker arrived. In that time, he had to make a decision that would affect 8 lives, including his own. James walked to his bedroom and looked at Margaret's picture on the nightstand. "Give me strength, Maggie," he whispered. "Help me know what to do." He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, James Morrison prayed. He prayed for wisdom, for courage, for guidance. He prayed for those 7 children who had already been through so much, and he prayed that whatever decision he made, it would be the right one. At 8:15, there was a soft knock on his door. James stood up, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. This was it, the moment of truth. He walked to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it. Elena stood there alone this time, her eyes red from crying all night. She looked at him with such hope and such fear that it nearly broke his heart. "Mr. Morrison," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Have you decided?" James looked at Elena's exhausted face and felt something shift inside him. He had spent the entire night wrestling with doubt and fear, but standing here now, looking into the eyes of this young woman who was trying so desperately to hold her family together, he knew what he had to do. "Come inside, Elena," he said gently. "We need to talk before the social worker arrives." Elena stepped into the house, her hands trembling. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing the same clothes from the night before. James gestured for her to sit down, and he took the chair across from her. "Elena, I'm not going to lie to you. This is the hardest decision I've ever had to make," James began. "I'm 52 years old. I live alone. I have a modest income. My house is small. I don't know if I'm strong enough or capable enough to do this." He saw the hope drain from Elena's face, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. She started to stand, her voice breaking. "I understand, Mr. Morrison. It was too much to ask. I'm sorry for bothering you. We'll figure something out somehow." "Wait," James said, holding up his hand. "I wasn't finished." He took a deep breath. "I'm going to do it. I'm going to talk to the social worker this morning. I'll apply for temporary custody while we work out the permanent arrangements. You and your brothers and sisters, all 7 of you, can stay with me." Elena's hands flew to her mouth, and she burst into tears. Not sad tears this time, but tears of relief and gratitude so overwhelming that her whole body shook. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you so much, Mr. Morrison. You don't know what this means to us." James felt his own eyes getting wet. "I can't promise it will be easy. We're going to have to figure things out as we go. But I promise you this, I won't let your family be separated. Your father was my friend, and he would have done the same for me if the situation was reversed." At 8:45, a white sedan pulled up in front of Robert's house. A woman in her 30s stepped out, carrying a briefcase and a clipboard. This was Mrs. Hartley, the social worker. James and Elena walked over together, and James introduced himself. "I'm James Morrison, Robert's neighbor and friend," he said, extending his hand. "I'd like to discuss the situation with the children." Mrs. Hartley looked surprised, but invited them inside Robert's house. The 6 younger children were sitting in the living room, their few belongings packed in garbage bags and old suitcases. Little Danny was crying softly, and the twins were holding each other tightly. Marcus stood by the window, his jaw clenched, trying to look tough but failing to hide the fear in his eyes. James explained to Mrs. Sarah Hartley that he wanted to take temporary custody of all 7 children. The social worker looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your willingness to help, but this is a very serious commitment. We're talking about 7 children, ranging from 6 to 24 years old. Do you have any experience with foster care? You understand the legal responsibilities involved?" "I was a teacher for 30 years, James said calmly. "I've worked with children and teenagers my entire adult life. I raised 2 children of my own, who are now successful adults. I know this isn't going to be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Mrs. Hartley asked him numerous questions about his financial situation, his health, his living arrangements, and his motivation for taking on such responsibility. James answered each question honestly, not trying to pretend everything would be perfect, but showing his genuine commitment to keeping the family together. After an hour of discussion and paperwork, Mrs. Hartley agreed to grant James temporary emergency custody for 30 days while a full evaluation could be completed. "This is highly unusual, Mr. Breen." "Morrison," she said, "but given the circumstances and your relationship with the family, I'm willing to give this a chance. However, I'll be conducting home visits, and if at any point I feel the children aren't being properly cared for, I will have to intervene." "I understand completely," James said. "You're just doing your job, and I respect that." When Mrs. Hartley left, the children gathered around James, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief.
Little Danny wrapped his arms around James's legs, and the twins were both crying and smiling at the same time.
Even Marcus, who had been so stoic, had tears running down his face. The reality of what James had just agreed to hit him fully at that moment. The 7 children were now his responsibility. He was their guardian, their protector, the person they would depend on for everything. The first few days were absolutely overwhelming. James had to figure out sleeping arrangements, which meant a lot of shuffling and rearranging. He gave his master bedroom to Elena and Sarah. The twins moved into the second bedroom. Marcus and Tommy took the third bedroom. James quickly worked to convert part of his garage into a makeshift bedroom for himself and Danny. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and dry, and little Danny seemed comforted by not being alone at night. Food was another massive challenge. James was used to cooking simple meals for one person. Now he had to prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 8 people. The first morning he tried to make pancakes and ended up burning half of them while the other half were still raw in the middle. The children ate them anyway, not complaining, which somehow made James feel even worse. Elena immediately stepped in to help. She showed James how her father used to organize meal preparation, how to cook in larger quantities, and how to shop for groceries on a tight budget. Together they created a system. Elena would help with cooking and managing the younger children, while James handled the paperwork, doctor appointments, and school registrations. School was its own nightmare. It was already 3 weeks into the semester, and getting all the children enrolled in their respective schools required mountains of paperwork. James spent hours on the phone with school administrators explaining the situation over and over again. He had to provide proof of guardianship, immunization records, and emergency contact information for each child. Marcus was struggling the most. At 19, he had dropped out of high school the year before to help his father with expenses. He was angry at the world, angry at the situation, and didn't seem to trust James at all. He would disappear for hours, coming back late at night, refusing to say where he had been. James tried to talk to him, but Marcus would just grunt responses and retreat to his room. Sarah, the 17-year-old, was quiet and withdrawn. She spent most of her time reading in corners, avoiding interaction with everyone. James learned from Elena that Sarah blamed herself for not being home when her father had the heart attack, thinking maybe she could have called for help sooner. The 11-year-old twins, Sophie and Sarah, were a whirlwind of energy. They fought constantly over everything from whose turn it was to use the bathroom to who got the last cookie. They tested every boundary James set, seeing how far they could push before he would react. James had never dealt with twin dynamics before and found himself exhausted just trying to keep up with them. 9-year-old Tommy was the easiest of all the children. He was quiet, helpful, and seemed to adapt quickly to the new living situation. He would help set the table without being asked, and always said please and thank you. But James noticed that Tommy never really smiled, never laughed like a 9-year-old should. The boy carried a sadness that was heartbreaking to witness. And then there was Danny, the 6-year-old. He had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming for his father. James would rush to his side, holding the small boy until he calmed down, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. Danny started following James everywhere during the day, afraid to let him out of his sight, terrified that he would lose another parent figure. The house was in constant chaos. There was never enough hot water for everyone to shower. The washing machine ran constantly, trying to keep up with the laundry from 7 children. The grocery bill was astronomical, far more than James had budgeted for. Within the first week, he had already dipped into his savings account. His own children called frequently, their concern evident. Jessica offered to send money, which James initially refused but eventually accepted when he realized he had no choice. Michael suggested maybe splitting the children up temporarily, just until James could get more stable, but James firmly said no. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. The neighbors had mixed reactions. Some brought over casseroles and offered help, impressed by James's sacrifice. Others whispered behind his back, saying he was foolish, that he had bitten off more than he could chew, that it would all fall apart within a month. Mrs. Patterson from across the street became an unexpected ally. She was a retired nurse and grandmother of 12. She started coming over in the afternoons, helping with homework and teaching James practical tips about managing a large household. "You're doing a good thing, James," she told him one day. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But despite the help and support, James felt like he was drowning. He fell into bed exhausted every night, only to be woken up by Danny's nightmares or the twins fighting, or Marcus coming home late. He started having doubts. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he couldn't do this. Maybe these children would have been better off with younger, more capable foster parents. One particularly difficult evening, about 3 weeks after the children moved in, everything seemed to go wrong at once. The washing machine broke down, flooding the laundry room. Tommy came home with a note from school saying he was failing math. The twins got into a physical fight over a toy, and Sarah ended up with a bloody nose. Marcus came home smelling like cigarette smoke and refused to explain where he had been. And dinner burned because James was too distracted trying to handle everything else. James stood in the middle of the chaotic kitchen, water seeping under the laundry room door, children arguing and crying around him, and he felt completely defeated. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. That's when he felt a small hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Elena standing beside him, her eyes full of understanding and compassion. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly, "why don't you go take a walk? I'll handle things here for a bit. You need a break." James looked up at Elena, seeing the maturity and strength in her eyes that shouldn't have to exist in someone so young. She had already lived through more hardship than most people twice her age. And here she was, offering him comfort when she had every reason to be struggling herself. "I can't just leave you with all this mess," James protested weakly, gesturing at the chaos surrounding them. "Yes, you can," Elena said firmly but kindly. "Go. Walk around the block. Clear your head. We'll still be here when you get back, and we'll figure it out together." James stood up slowly, his body aching from exhaustion. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the cool evening air. As he walked down the sidewalk, he could still hear the muffled sounds of the children through the walls. But with each step, he felt like he could breathe a little easier. He walked for nearly an hour, his mind racing through everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks. He thought about the social worker's upcoming visit in a few days, which would determine whether he could keep the children permanently. He thought about the mounting bills, the broken washing machine that would cost money he didn't have to repair. He thought about Marcus's anger, Sarah's silence, Tommy's sadness, and Danny's nightmares. But then he thought about other moments, too. He remembered the morning when Danny had climbed into his lap during breakfast and said, "I like living with you, Mr. James." He remembered when the twins had made him a card that said, "Best grandpa ever," even though he wasn't their grandfather. He remembered Elena's grateful smile every time he did something to help, no matter how small. When James returned home, he found the house surprisingly calm. Elena had cleaned up the water from the laundry room as best she could. The twins were sitting quietly at the table doing homework, their earlier fight apparently forgotten. Tommy was helping Danny with a puzzle. Sarah was reading, and Marcus was nowhere to be seen, probably in his room. Elena had even managed to throw together sandwiches for everyone's dinner. It wasn't fancy, but it was food, and the children were eating without complaint. She looked up when James entered and gave him a small smile. "See, we survived," she said. "We're tougher than we look." That night, after all the children were in bed, James sat down with Elena at the kitchen table. They had developed a habit of having these late-night conversations, going over the next day's schedule and discussing any problems that had come up. "Elena, I need to be honest with you," James said quietly. "I'm worried about the evaluation next week. The house is too small, money is tighter than I expected, and I'm not sure I'm doing a good enough job with everyone." Elena reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Mr. Dillon, Morrison, do you know what my father used to tell us? He said that family isn't about having a perfect house or lots of money. It's about showing up every day and trying your best. That's what you're doing. The social worker will see that. But Marcus," James said, his voice heavy with concern, "he's barely spoken to me in 3 weeks. He stays out late, and I don't know where he goes or what he's doing. What if the social worker thinks I can't handle him?" "Marcus is angry," Elena explained. "He's angry at God for taking our mother, angry at the world for taking our father, angry at himself for not being able to fix everything. He's not angry at you, he just doesn't know how to deal with his feelings." "How do I help him?" James asked, feeling helpless. "Keep trying," Elena said simply. "Don't give up on him. Eventually he'll come around." The next morning, James decided to take Elena's advice. He woke up early and knocked on Marcus's door. When there was no answer, he opened it carefully. Marcus was lying in bed, awake but staring at the ceiling. "Marcus, I'm going for a walk before breakfast." "Want to join me?" James asked. "No," Marcus said flatly. "All right," James said, not pushing. "The offer stands if you change your mind." James did this every morning for the next 5 days. Every morning, Marcus said no. But on the 6th morning, James knocked on the door and found Marcus already dressed, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Let's go," Marcus said gruffly, not meeting James's eyes. They walked in silence for the first 10 minutes. James didn't try to force conversation, just let Marcus set the pace. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Why are you doing this?" he asked abruptly. "Taking all of us in." "You don't have to. We're not your responsibility." James thought carefully before answering. "Your father was my friend, but that's not really why. I'm doing this because when I look at you and your brothers and sisters, I see people who deserve a chance to stay together, to grow up as a family. And I have the ability to help make that happen, so how could I not try?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I heard the neighbors talking. They said you're crazy, that you'll give up on us soon enough, that old people can't handle kids like us." "Do you think I'll give up?" James asked. Marcus kicked at a stone on the sidewalk. "I don't know. Everyone else has. My mom died. My dad died. Nobody really wants 7 kids. They just pretend to care." James stopped walking and turned to face Marcus directly. "I'm not pretending, Marcus. I'll be honest with you. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. I make mistakes every day. I burn dinner. I don't always know the right thing to say, and I definitely don't have all the answers. But I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me." For the first time, James saw something crack in Marcus's tough exterior. The young man's eyes got watery, and he quickly looked away. "My dad used to say you were a good man," Marcus said quietly. "I guess he was right." They walked back to the house, and while Marcus didn't suddenly become a different person, something had shifted. He started coming home at reasonable hours. He began helping Tommy with his math homework without being asked. He even fixed the washing machine himself, having learned basic repair skills from his father. Sarah was a different challenge. She continued to keep to herself, lost in her books, barely speaking to anyone. James noticed she wasn't eating much and seemed to be getting thinner. He was worried but didn't know how to reach her. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally helped. She had been a nurse for 40 years and recognized the signs of depression. She pulled James aside one afternoon and suggested he talk to Sarah about seeing a counselor. That evening, James sat down next to Sarah in the corner where she was reading. "Sarah, can we talk for a minute?" She looked up reluctantly, closing her book. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, not at all," James assured her. "I'm just worried about you. You seem sad and you're not eating much. I thought maybe it would help to talk to someone, a professional who knows how to help people who are grieving." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I should have been there," she whispered, "when Dad had the heart attack. I was at the library studying. If I had been home, maybe I could have called for help sooner. Maybe he would still be alive." James felt his heart break for this girl, carrying such an impossible burden. "Sarah, your father's heart attack was massive. The doctor said even if someone had been standing right next to him, there was nothing that could have been done. His death is not your fault, not even a little bit." Sarah started crying, really crying for the first time since her father's death. James put his arm around her shoulders and let her cry, not trying to stop her tears or make her feel better with empty words. Sometimes people just needed to grieve. After that night, Sarah slowly started to open up more. James arranged for her to see a counselor twice a week, and gradually she began to engage with the family again. She helped Elena with cooking and even started to smile occasionally. The twins, Sophie and Sarah, were exhausting but also brought unexpected joy into the house. They had wild imaginations and would create elaborate games that sometimes involved the entire household. They convinced James to play Tea Party, made Tommy be a dragon in their fantasy adventure, and even got Marcus to help them build a fort in the living room. Tommy remained quiet but slowly started showing signs of the happy child he used to be. James discovered that Tommy loved drawing and bought him a sketchbook and colored pencils with some of the money Jessica had sent. Tommy would sit for hours drawing pictures of his family, including James in every single one. Danny's nightmares became less frequent as he started to feel more secure. He still followed James around like a shadow, but he also started playing more with Tommy and even made a friend at school. One night, about 5 weeks after moving in, Danny called James Grandpa Jim for the first time. James's eyes filled with tears, and he hugged the little boy tightly. As the day of the permanent custody hearing approached, James's anxiety grew. Mrs. Hartley had made several visits, inspecting the house, interviewing the children separately, and evaluating how everyone was adjusting. She was professional but gave no indication of what her recommendation would be. The day before the hearing, James received unexpected news. A distant aunt of the children, someone Elena had mentioned briefly, had come forward claiming she should have custody of at least the 3 youngest children. She lived in another state and argued that the children would have a better life with a blood relative who had more space and financial resources. James felt his stomach drop. After everything, after all the progress they had made, the family might still be torn apart. That evening, he gathered all 7 children in the living room. He explained the situation honestly, not wanting to hide the truth from them. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I've loved having you here," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've changed my life in ways I never expected. This house feels like a home again." Elena stood up, her face determined. "We have to fight this. We have to show them that we belong together, here with you." "How?" James asked, feeling helpless against the legal system. "We tell the truth," Elena said firmly. "All of us. We tell them what this family means to us." The courthouse was an imposing building with tall marble columns and steps that seemed to go on forever. James held Danny's hand as they climbed those steps together, the other 6 children following behind. Elena walked beside him, wearing the most professional outfit she owned, her face set with determination. Marcus had even put on a button-down shirt, looking uncomfortable but standing tall. Sarah carried a folder of documents they had prepared. The twins were uncharacteristically quiet, sensing the importance of the day. Tommy walked close to his siblings, his hand clutching the edge of Elena's jacket. Inside the courtroom, they sat together on hard wooden benches, waiting for their case to be called. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. Across the aisle sat a well-dressed woman in her 40s, with perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry. This was Aunt Linda, Robert's cousin, whom none of the children had seen in over 10 years. She sat with her lawyer, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, occasionally glancing over at the children with what she probably thought was a caring expression. Mrs. Hartley, the social worker, sat near the front with her own stack of files and reports. James tried to read her expression but couldn't tell what she was thinking. Finally, the judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Margaret Reynolds was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes but a stern demeanor. She had been a family court judge for 25 years and had seen every possible situation imaginable. The proceedings began with Aunt Linda's lawyer presenting her case. He painted a picture of a successful businesswoman with a large house in the suburbs, financial stability, and a genuine desire to provide for her late cousin's children. He argued that while James's intentions were admirable, he was simply not equipped to handle 7 children at his age and with his limited resources. "My client has a 5-bedroom house," the lawyer stated confidently. She has the financial means to provide for these children's every need, including college funds. She is blood family, which should carry significant weight in this decision. While we acknowledge that Mr. Morrison has done his best, the question is not about effort, but about what is truly best for these children." Then Aunt Linda herself took the stand. She spoke about family responsibility and her regret at not being more involved in the children's lives earlier. "I was focused on my career," she admitted, "but Robert's death was a wake-up call. These children are my family, and they belong with me. At least the younger ones, who need stability and resources that I can provide." When it was time for James to speak, his hands were shaking as he approached the witness stand. His lawyer, a kind woman named Ms. Chen, who was working mostly pro bono because she believed in the case, asked him to explain his relationship with the family. James spoke from his heart. He talked about his friendship with Robert, about watching these children grow up next door, about the promise he had made to keep them together. He was honest about the challenges, about the tight finances, about the mistakes he had made. "I'm not perfect," James said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I burn dinner sometimes. The house is crowded. Money is tight. But these children have already lost both their parents. They've already been through more pain than any child should experience. The one thing they still have is each other. And I believe, with everything in me, that keeping them together is more important than having a bigger house or more money." Or when Mrs. Hartley was called to give her evaluation. The courtroom fell silent. This was the moment that would likely determine everything. She stood at the witness stand and opened her folder of observations and reports. "Your Honor," she began, "I have conducted extensive evaluations of both households over the past several weeks. I've made multiple visits to Mr. Morrison's home, interviewed each child separately, and assessed the living conditions and emotional well-being of the children." She paused, and James felt like he couldn't breathe. "When I first learned that Mr. Morrison wanted to take in all 7 children, I had serious reservations. The practical concerns were significant. However, what I have witnessed over these weeks has been remarkable. Yes, the house is small. Yes, finances are tight. But what I have seen is a family healing together. I have watched these children begin to smile again, to trust again, to hope again." Mrs. Hartley pulled out several pages from her folder. "I have reports here from each child's school. Marcus has started attending classes regularly and is considering getting his GED. Sarah's teachers report that she is participating in class again. The twins' behavior has improved dramatically. Tommy is making friends, and little Danny's kindergarten teacher says he has stopped having meltdowns during the day. She looked directly at the judge. Mrs. Linda Chen may have more financial resources, but she is essentially a stranger to these children. She has not been part of their lives. And most importantly, she only wants to take the 3 youngest, which would separate this family. Then came the most powerful part of the hearing. The judge asked if any of the children wanted to speak. Elena immediately stood up and approached the witness stand. At 24, she was legally an adult and could choose where she wanted to live, but her testimony would carry weight regarding her siblings. "Your Honor," Elena began, her voice clear and strong despite the tears in her eyes. "My father worked himself to exhaustion raising us alone after my mother died. The one thing he always told us was that we were a family, and family sticks together no matter what. He would be heartbroken to know that we might be separated now. Jesus is saving, Mr. Morrison didn't have to help us. He could have had a peaceful, quiet life alone. But he chose to open his home and his heart to 7 grieving children he wasn't related to. In the past 6 weeks, he has shown up for every single one of us. He stays up late helping with homework. He listens to our problems. He holds Danny when he has nightmares. He's teaching Marcus to be a better man. He's gotten Sarah the help she needed. He plays with the twins even when he's exhausted. He encourages Tommy's drawing." Her voice broke with emotion. "He's not trying to replace our father. No one ever could, but he's giving us something precious. He's giving us the chance to stay together, to still be a family. That's worth more than any big house or college fund." Then, one by one, the other children asked to speak. The judge listened to each of them carefully. Marcus spoke about how James had never given up on him, even when he was difficult and angry. "He kept showing up, kept asking me to go on walks, kept treating me like I mattered. Nobody else has ever done that for me." Sarah talked about how James had noticed she was struggling and had gotten her help, how he had told her that her father's death wasn't her fault. "He saved my life," she said simply. The twins, speaking in their tag team way they had, talked about how their house felt like a home now, how Grandpa Jim played games with them and made them laugh even when they were sad. Tommy showed the judge his sketchbook filled with drawings of the family, every picture including James. "He's part of our family now," Tommy said quietly. When little Danny took the stand, the judge had to lower the microphone significantly. The 6-year-old looked tiny in the witness chair, but his voice was clear when he spoke. "I don't want to leave Grandpa Jim," Danny said, tears running down his face. "He gives me hugs when I'm scared. He reads me stories. He promised he won't leave me like Mommy and Daddy did. Please don't make me go away from him." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, including the judges. Even Aunt Linda looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing for the first time what she was really asking for. The judge called a brief recess to review all the materials and make her decision. Those 30 minutes felt like the longest of James's life. The children clustered around him on the bench, and he put his arms around as many as he could reach. "Whatever happens," he whispered to them, "I love all of you. That won't change." When they were called back into the courtroom, Judge Reynolds looked at everyone with a serious expression. She addressed Aunt Linda first. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your willingness to step forward and offer your home. However, I have several concerns. First, you have not been an active part of these children's lives for many years. Second, and most importantly, your proposal would separate 3 children from their siblings. The psychological research is very clear about the importance of keeping sibling groups together, especially after trauma and loss." Then she turned to James. "Mr. Morrison, this court has reviewed Mrs. Hartley's reports, the testimony of the children, and all the evidence presented today. While your living situation is not ideal by conventional standards, it is clear that you have provided these children with something invaluable: stability, love, and the ability to remain together as a family unit." James held his breath. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I am granting you full permanent guardianship of all 7 children. The court recognizes that you may need support services, and I am ordering that the state provide assistance with housing allowances and health care coverage for the children. Miss Hartley will continue to check in periodically, but this is no longer a temporary arrangement. These children are legally your family now." The courtroom erupted. The children were crying and hugging James all at once. Elena threw her arms around him, sobbing with relief. Even Marcus was wiping tears from his eyes. The twins were jumping up and down. Tommy was smiling. Really smiling, for the first time in weeks. And Danny climbed into James's lap and wouldn't let go. Mrs. Hartley came over with a genuine smile, shaking James's hand. "Congratulations," she said. "I'll be checking in, but I have a feeling you're all going to be just fine." Aunt Linda and her lawyer left quickly, but James felt no animosity toward them. They had done what they thought was right, even if it wasn't what the family needed. 2 years passed like a whirlwind. The house was still crowded, money was still tight, but somehow they made it work. James's own children, Jessica and Michael, had come around completely. They visited regularly and had fully embraced their new extended family. Jessica's kids loved having so many cousins to play with. Michael and his wife even helped Marcus study for his GED, which he passed with flying colors. Elena had graduated from community college and gotten a job as a social worker, inspired by her own experience with the system. She still lived at home, helping James manage the household while saving money. She had found her calling in helping other families in crisis, often sharing her own story to give people hope. Marcus had turned his life around completely. He got his GED and earned a full scholarship to a vocational school where he was training to be an electrician. He had discovered that he loved working with his hands, fixing things, solving problems. The angry young man who had barely spoken to James that first month was now one of his strongest supporters. Marcus often said that James had shown him what it meant to be a good man. Sarah had blossomed in the most beautiful way. With therapy and support, she had worked through her grief and guilt. She was now in her last year of high school, planning to study psychology in college. She wanted to help other young people who were struggling with loss and trauma. Her teacher said she was one of the most empathetic students they had ever taught. The twins, now 13, were still a handful, but in the best possible way. They were involved in every school activity imaginable, from drama club to soccer to science fair. They kept the whole house entertained with their energy and creativity. They had learned to channel their emotions in healthier ways and rarely fought anymore. Tommy, now 11, had discovered an incredible talent for art. James had enrolled him in classes at the community center, and his drawings had been featured in a local gallery. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, but he smiled easily now and had a close group of friends. He was talking about maybe becoming an artist or an art teacher someday. And Danny, now 8 years old, barely remembered a time before living with Grandpa Jim. The nightmares had stopped over a year ago. He was thriving in school, playing baseball, and bringing home friends for playdates. He still had moments when he missed his parents terribly, but he knew he was loved and safe. On what would have been Robert's birthday, the whole family gathered around the dinner table. James had finally bought an extension leaf for the table after months of everyone being cramped together. They went around sharing favorite memories of Robert, laughing and crying together. "Dad would be so proud of all of you," Elena said, looking at her siblings. "And so grateful to you, Mr. Morrison. You kept his family together when no one else would." James looked around at the faces surrounding him, these 7 people who had completely changed his life. The house that had been so quiet and empty 3 years ago was now filled with noise and laughter and life. It was chaotic and messy and wonderful. "I'm the one who should be grateful," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You all gave me a reason to wake up in the morning. You made this house a home again. You taught me that family isn't just about blood or biology. It's about showing up, about choosing to love people even when it's hard, about being there for each other no matter what." Little Danny, sitting next to James, tugged on his sleeve. "Grandpa Jim, will you always be our family?" James picked up the boy and held him close. "Always, Danny, forever and always. You're stuck with me." As they finished dinner and the children dispersed to do homework and chores, Elena stayed behind to help James clean up. They worked in comfortable silence for a while before she spoke. "You know," she said softly, "that day I knocked on your door. I was so scared you would say no. I didn't know what we would do. I was terrified you would ask me," James admitted with a small laugh. "I didn't think I could do it." "But you did," Elena said, smiling at him. "You did it, and you changed all of our lives." James looked around his crowded, noisy, imperfect home and realized something profound. When Margaret died, he thought his life of purpose and meaning was over. He thought he was just marking time until his own end came. But these 7 children had shown him that it was never too late to make a difference, never too late to build a family, never too late to choose love over fear. Sometimes the biggest blessings came disguised as the hardest challenges. Sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones you chose, not the ones you were born into. And sometimes when a beautiful young woman knocked on your door with 6 siblings in tow and said, "All 7 of us are yours," the only answer that made any sense was yes. Because that's what family did. They showed up. They stuck together. They chose each other again and again, every single day. And in that choice, James Morrison had found not just 7 children to care for, but a reason to live fully again, a home filled with love and a legacy that would last far beyond his years.